Greetings, podcast listeners. Welcome back to a new episode of History from one student to another. In this week's episode, we will be examining how Stalin used repression to gain absolute power during his rule over the Soviet Union. Let's begin with his use of secret police organizations. Even from the foundation of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Bolsheviks, or Russian Communists, relied on secret police to secure their rule. The first secret police organization, called the Cheka, was established in December 1917. It was intended to be a temporary institution that was to be abolished once Lenin and the Bolsheviks had secured their power. Although the initial purpose was simply to investigate counter-revolutionary crimes, it soon evolved into an element of summary justice, which meant suspected offenders were punished without a court hearing or jury trial, and also became involved in a campaign of terror against the upper class and enemies of the Bolshevik Party. Although the Cheka was opposed by many Bolsheviks due to its excessive punishments and nature, its continued existence was without a doubt essential to the Bolshevik Party's consolidation of power. Following the end of the Russian Civil War, the Cheka was disbanded, and its functions were transferred to the less powerful GPU, standing for the State Political Directorate. With this, repression against the general population decreased. However, under Joseph Stalin's rule, the secret police regained its power and was renamed the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, or NKVD for short. It was no longer subject to party control or restricted by law, and became a direct mechanism which Stalin used to repress and control his own party and country, especially during the Great Terror from August 1936 to March 1938. Throughout Joseph Stalin's rule, the NKVD remained the most powerful and feared unit of the Soviet government. Although the KGB, the secret police organization that existed after Stalin's death until 1991, no longer imposed large-scale terror, purges and deportation, it continued to be used by the Kremlin to suppress political and religious opposition. With the purpose of gaining absolute power, Stalin expelled opposition from the party in 1927 and utilized police repression against his opponents, Leon Trotsky, who was assassinated by the NKVD in August 1940, and Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, who were both executed by firing squad on the 25th of August 1936. Later in 1929, Nikolai Bukharin, another opponent of his, was expelled from the Politburo. He was later arrested in February 1937, charged with conspiracy to overthrow the Soviet state, and executed in March 1938. But if we go back in time, by 1934, he had all but eliminated potential opposition to his leadership, and consolidated his power as party leader and leader of the state. Despite this, he continued to purge ordinary members of the party and terrorize the Soviet people with extensive arrests and executions. The Great Terror was sparked by the murder of Sergei Kirov on December 1, 1934. He was a full member of the ruling political bureau, leader of the Leningrad Party, and a prominent member of the ruling elite. He gained popularity for his public speaking abilities and advocacy for workers' welfare in Leningrad. Some party members had even secretly proposed to him that he replace Stalin as general secretary. Although it is unlikely that Kirov presented a substantial threat to Stalin's political dominance, he did disagree with some of Stalin's policies, leading for Stalin to doubt his and other party members' allegiance. Hence, as evidence shows, Stalin and the NKVD planned out Kirov's assassination by removing key security personnel, allowing for Leonid Nikolaev to enter the Smolny Institute offices and shoot Kirov in the back of the neck. Although there is significant evidence that Stalin had a role in Kirov's assassination, he used the murder to his advantage, introducing strict laws against political crimes and conducting a witch hunt for Nikolaev's co-conspirators, during which he was able to spread terror throughout the Soviet Union, stabilizing his rule through the murder of millions of innocent citizens and party members during the Great Terror. During the Great Terror, or what is also known as the Great Purge, or Yezhovshchina, well-known show trials took place, including the Moscow trials, which led to the aforementioned executions of Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, and further executions of Tomsky, Rykov, and the commanding-in-chief of the Red Army and 7 leading generals. The Great Terror peaked in 1937 and 1938, when 20 million innocent Soviet citizens were deported to labor camps and prisons, where approximately half of them died. Politicians and ordinary citizens lived in fear, while party members who were loyal to Stalin were rewarded with new flats, jobs, holidays, and other benefits. Following the Great Terror, everyone was so afraid of Stalin that mass arrests and repression were no longer necessary, as everyone was completely submissive to his rule. Joseph Stalin ruled as the absolute dictator of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics until his sudden and unexpected death in March 1953. For just a short break from the podcast, I would like to say thank you for your continued support and listening to this podcast. I would be extremely grateful if you could further support my podcast by buying me a coffee via the link in the description. Anyway, let's get back to the episode. Now let's explore why Stalin used such harsh forms of repression and violence. One of the reasons was issues within the country as a whole. Stalin's primary goal in interwar Russia was the achievement of socialism in one country, which was restricted by its technical and economic backwardness. When Kamenev and Zinoviev stated their view that Soviet Russia cannot cope with the internal difficulties unless an international revolution happens, Stalin saw their views as a lack of faith in the Soviet working class and the peasant masses, and a departure from their Leninist position. He resorted to the use of violence and repression to achieve his goals when faced with opposition from within the party. Another critical reason for Stalin's use of repression and violence was the urgency sparked by the fear of war, with both the threat of Japan and Nazi Germany. Stalin believed that Russia was threatened by both powers from the east and the west. Japan presented itself as a threat due to its increasing hostility to neighbouring countries, such as in Manchuria in 1931 to 1933. Meanwhile, with its anti-communist nature, Nazi Germany was also becoming a threat to Russia's national safety. Hitler's talks of peace were not taken at face value by Stalin, due to Hitler's expansionist policy of Lebensraum and threats against Soviet Russia and France. Stalin perceived in Europe as unstable. Dangers from the Far East may have come as far as Europe, whilst there was a threat within Europe itself. Therefore, Stalin resorted to repression and terror to take control of Russia's internal difficulties. The country needed to be internally stabilized with the possibility of a war. The third and final reason was paranoia and a fear of betrayal. According to the author Helena Sheehan, Stalin was deeply affected when his wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, committed suicide in 1932, and his style of ruling became much more antagonistic and revengeful. Stalin became insecure and desired to seek absolute control through repressive means. Stalin formed a close relationship with Bukharin, even asking to change apartments with him, as the memory of his wife was just too painful. But, according to Sheehan, Stalin was jealous of his intellectual acuity and all-round popularity, and vengeful against any alternative to his absolute authority. Hence, in the case of Bukharin, he was arrested on false charges, while Stalin fabricated allegations against him. Before his false confession, Bukharin underwent severe torture and intimidation. In conclusion, Stalin used repression as a tool to strike fear into the population of the USSR, ensuring obedience, and gaining absolute power by removing the possibility of opposition from within the party itself. That brings an end to this episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of my podcast. Please click follow or subscribe to be notified when the next episode of History from one student to another is released. There are links in the description for you to access additional revision material on my website, or provide me with feedback, suggestions and questions, and also links to my social medias and methods of contacting me. Again, I would be extremely grateful if you would be so kind as to buy me a coffee via the link in the description. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.